You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today I'm speaking with Heloïse Prieur, a French language and culture coach and translator and the founder of Belle Entente. She's here to discuss an expression that may seem to indicate that the French don't always say what they mean, but that actually tells us a whole lot more about the Anglo-American perception of the French. Double entendre. So welcome, Heloïse Prieur, to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you on today.
Good morning.
Good morning. And Heloïse is a French language and culture coach and a translator and the founder of Belle Entente. So can you tell us a little bit about sort of your work and how you got into this sort of multifaceted career that you have these days?
Thank you very much, Emily. Thank you for inviting me to your podcast. So I am a French language and culture coach, as you said, and for me that goes absolutely hand in hand. I teach French one-to-one and for small groups at all levels, so from total beginners to even very advanced speakers who are wishing to take their language skills and cultural understanding to the next level, understanding the codes of French culture, whether it is for professional or social personal purposes. And I work on various projects around this, whether it is writing speeches intended for a French audience or helping with job interviews preparation at senior level for joining French companies. And my students are based in many different countries, as I work a lot online, and they come from very different cultures. So that's super interesting to see how we can, just facilitate this understanding of the French culture from different standpoints around the world. And I'm also a specialized translator for French English in the beauty and luxury industry, as well as on sustainability and environmental topics.
Awesome. So, I mean, it seems as though you're kind of the perfect person to come on and chat with, as you were highlighting, translation and cultural translation go hand in hand. It's not just about the language, and here that's sort of what we talk about is all of these cultural aspects of France. And the phrase really that I wanted to talk to you about has a little bit of an overlap with the name of your business. So your business is Belle Entente. Entente is understanding. And I wanted to talk to you about double entendre. So entendre is the French verb to understand. In English, we say double entendre a lot. I get the sense that it might not be a phrase that we talk about, that we use quite so often or in the same way in French. So let's zoom out for a second. So entente, understanding, agreement, what did you sort of mean when you thought about this phrase Belle Entente and founded your business as Belle Entente?
So belle means beautiful, and also has a connotation of something that goes smoothly and also that is eventually successful in French. And the most important word is entente, coming from entendre, which, as you said, is much more than hearing or perceiving a sound in French. It means to understand the profound meaning of things, as in the expression j'entends bien, which means I get that, I get it. And you also have the pronominal verb in French, s'entendre, which means to get along. So I've been teaching French for a while, but I created Belle Entente around the time when Brexit happened, as I've been based in the UK for a few years, as a reference to the Entente Cordiale between France and the UK, as I believe that, beyond governments, the people play a major role in building a sort of private diplomacy and connections between countries and culture, and thus this must be particularly encouraged and reinforced when official diplomatic discussions are a bit under pressure. And so if we go back to the meaning of entendre, it also relates to the fact that learning or practicing a foreign language to a certain level requires not only to hear a word and know what it means literally, but as importantly, to understand what the word means in the mouth of the person who speaks at the moment they speak. And I mean, this is the point of your podcast here on Navigating the French, right? So context, culture, history, as well as who speak, like their age, their socioeconomic background, etc., is everything. And you have to understand what the norm is for each context to be able to decipher the intention of your interlocutor. So are they going by the norm, or are they crossing a line in one sense or another, in one direction or another? And are they adopting a different register than the one expected? And what does it mean? What is the intention behind it? And that's communicating, and that's understanding each other. It's not literally just what the words mean. So for instance, if your new boss is using the tu, like the informal and from proximity you in French, it is certainly not the same thing as a new friend using the tu. Or when a politician who is used to a formal and elegant level of French suddenly publicly uses argot or swear words, it probably means much more than when you or me casually use the same word, right? So this is about entendre and really, really deeply understanding the intention behind those who speak. And these days, this is particularly important because we have more and more artificial intelligence and automatic translation tools, and they are super useful. But if you solely rely on them, you will end up with awkward situations and misunderstandings. So we learn foreign languages because we want to communicate, not for the, mere pleasure of learning vocabulary list or new conjugation patterns. So that's why real entendre and belle entente and entente was important in the name of my activity. But to go back to our topic, I totally agree with you. Double entendre is not a phrase I've heard a lot in the mouth of French people, but I've heard it in non-native French speakers, which is pretty revealing in itself. And this is not a pun. What do we mean by double entendre? So this is, as I believe, like a word or an expression which is capable of two interpretation, which is one that is usually less acceptable socially, or that you don't want to be accused of being too direct about, because it can be subversive, ironic, or risque, which is another French language borrowing. It is revealing that the French words double entendre are used in English to convey this notion. Because if I zoom out myself and put it in a wider context, there are many words borrowed from French in the English language, as there are many English words who are carried over into the French language. So if we looked at both directions, the words borrowed from English into French, as we know, are dominant in the field of business, entrepreneurship, etc. That's where English has become very influential. And this reflects a kind of admiration and aspiration the French have for the Anglo-Saxon sort of liberal culture. Not necessarily as a society model, certainly not, but more the fact that we admire what we perceive as the talent for business of English and American culture. To speak very, very quickly, I believe you have a whole session about entrepreneur.
Yeah.
On the other side, so let's look at the French words that are used in English. And beyond the huge heritage from Latin and Greek, we have like predominantly 2-3 lexicon fields that are borrowed from French. We have words relating to a certain lifestyle, like art de vivre, crème de la crème, de rigueur, joie de vivre, chic, café. The words from gastronomy and wine, apéritif, sommelier, cépage, soufflé, etc. So that's definitely a field where English borrow a lot from the French language. We have another field, which is, I think, the matters of the heart, and particularly in a risque context, right? Like ménage à trois, 5 à 7, femme fatale, tête-à-tête, liaison. And we have some words which, like double entendre or double entendre, denote a capacity to sort of play on words, to master the art of language, to articulate very cleverly with wits, and to be a bit subversive, but remaining very polite on the front. And it's really a combination of this elegance and risque, really. And it's, for me, the way I perceive it as a French person is as if the French have this image of sort of even living on a theater stage, like a very elegant, full of life and body school theater stage. Like double entendre, you have expressions like au fait, to be au fait. Like, so these are words referring to the fact that there is a more confidential level of knowledge, a bit of mystery. You have words like blasé, which to me, again, convey like an attitude that translates very much visually. That's a bit dramatic. So all this, for me, explains why double entendre can be a popular phrase among non-French people, because it relates to this image of French people that is probably the fruit of history. But of course, it's just a partial view of what the French society and culture truly is.
Absolutely. And I think you're right. It is very telling how we use double entendre in English to evoke some of these maybe more scandalous, sexy kind of mindset. But then I think there's also a piece of it that I do see, even if we're not using the phrase double entendre in French, I think there is, and you alluded to that as well in this idea that the French have of Anglo-Americans as being really good in business and maybe slightly more straight talkers, is that I get the impression that the French often either mean more than what they say, or maybe more than that, they expect their interlocutor to intuit a little bit more of what they mean than maybe I as an American would expect of the person I'm speaking to. Does that feel true to you?
Oh, that's such a good question, and I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to set the record straight here, because well, it's both a bit complex, like complicated, but also very simple. So, no, on a general basis, the French do not mean more than they say. I mean, this is all relative, right? And we have to think here about the sort of scale of openness, acceptation of confrontation. So to give you a few examples on this scale, a few examples that I can talk about. So the English people are not very direct. They are extremely polite and non-confrontational. So you need to be able to intuit a lot when communicating here in the UK. And again, that's speaking very broadly, but that works as a rule. And on the other end, for instance, you have like German culture or Dutch culture. They are very honest and very direct, and they don't mean to be impolite. They're just not taking any particular gloves and are very concrete and explicit about, what they want to say. American culture, I mean, you correct me if I get this wrong, but for me, borrows really from the two ends, like taking a lot of gloves and having a huge amount by French standards of political correctness, by French standards, but still being extremely direct and to the point when it needs to be, like in business or in sort of transactional conversations. So French, where do we sit on this scale? We sit in the middle. So we do have a language that allows us to go for very polite and circumambulated manners. And that's when things get complicated, and we can talk about language registers later on. And we use these convoluted manners every day in modern life. But at the same time, we are fairly direct and explicit in comparison to, for instance, the British. So let me give you a couple of examples to illustrate that. So like something I experienced very personally. So I'm a Parisian born and bred. I've been living in Paris most of my life before moving to London. And in a French environment, I would be qualified as a person as fairly polite, diplomatic, even sometimes with sort of English style of politeness, again by French standards. And here in London, I'm still the same person. And despite having adopted, I believe, a few of the English manners, I feel a bit like a brute most of the time, to be honest, because I really feel like I'm much more direct than my English interlocutors. And we have like another example could be like I have a program for French beginners to allow them to be able to introduce themselves and start a conversation on the main conversation topics in French when you first meet somebody or start to build your social life with French people. And in the first lesson, we address the "Comment ça va?" question. How are you? And the answer you can give and you will hear. So when a French person replies "Ça va bien?" I'm okay, I'm fine, very well, they usually mean it. So there's nothing to intuit from that. When they say "ça va pas mal," not too bad, it's still positive. And that's something I really have to explain to some of my students. Not too bad. It's like all weighted, the pros and the cons. I'm okay. It's good. I don't need you to understand or to deduct that there's something wrong. And last, French people can also say, ça ne va pas très bien, not too well, or bof, pas terrible, not great. And do you need to intuit a lot? No, it's just like they are fairly direct about telling you where they're staying on that day, and that, you just have to take into account this information that they're not having a great day. You don't need to sit for 2 hours and have a discussion. It's just being a bit honest and direct about how one feels that day.
Yeah, I've encountered that a lot in France, hearing people say things like, you ask them, oh, do you want to go, get a drink or something? And they're like, why not? And you're like, oh, do you not want to go? And they're like, no, I just said, why not? Like, sure. Americans, I think we do tend to be like, that would be amazing. When really it's like, sure, a drink sounds nice. And you're right. The French are a little more, honest with how excited they are, but they're still going to come and they're still going to enjoy it. It doesn't need to be life-changing.
Yeah, no, exactly.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may enjoy our sister podcast, Life in Diasporas, which attempts to understand what it means to be Black in a European country in the 21st century through enlightened and thoughtful discussions. Listen now to Life in Diasporas on Paris Underground Radio. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French.
I mean, you are American, right? So
yes.
For you, it's in that the translation works in that sense that we are less like super enthusiastic about everything. But yeah, and for me, living in the UK, it's more like when I have to plan something with a British person, I have to be very like, would you like to meet? Oh yes, that would be lovely. Okay. So shall we meet? Yes. What would you think? Like, yes. Okay. So I have to decide for the time and the day, because otherwise we're going to take hours to proceed.
Now, you alluded a little bit earlier to this idea of the tu and the vous, the two different kinds of you. That's just one indication that's very easy for a foreigner to see of a wider overarching kind of means in which the French maybe modulate the way that they're speaking to make sure that they're conveying what they want, and also to convey the respect that they have for the person that they're speaking to. And this is sort of this idea of a language register. Can you tell me a little bit about sort of how that works when it comes to, like you were saying, infusing the right amount of what you mean into what you hope the person you're speaking to is going to understand in French?
Yeah. So language registers, they are super important in French, and they relate to, expressing yourself in a sort of consistent manner, including vocabulary and how you grammatically build your sentences. So it's really part of, I see it in my daily activity of learning a language. It's not, as I said, learning the word, but how you build and articulate a sentence in which kind of lexicon field you're going to resort to. And that's the difference between, for instance, someone who masters well a language is they can be consistent. And if they want to speak formally, they will know which word to use. Whereas someone who is still, work in progress will probably mix up very formal and very colloquial or even slang in the same word. So to keep things simple, in French, we have like a formal level, soutenu, colloquial, courant, and we have familiar, where you find also argot, slang, and swear words. So I'm not talking here about dialects, which can be regional or even like the result of mixing French with another cultural or linguistic heritage. That is different. I'm just talking about language register in the same French language. So what characterizes formal in French can be longer words, so more syllabs, more words, more convoluted conjugation, the French delicacy, the full articulation of the negation, ne pas, sort of more formal ways of asking questions by, resorting to the subject-verb inversion rather than just the est que or just reading the tone of your voice. So formal is how you would write a formal speech, an official letter for work purposes, for instance, or that's also the register used in classic literature. And contrary to a common misconception, it is very much alive. It is very much in use. Alongside the colloquial, which is how French people talk on a daily basis, and including those who resort to formal register in their communications. So colloquial is characterized by more simplicity in terms of grammar and conjugation, the use of the pronoun on instead of the nous to say we, because on is the third person of the singular, so it's easier to conjugate. And sometimes also you have noticed we drop the ne in the negation ne pas on our daily when communicating orally. So we have like j'en veux pas for je n'en veux pas, I don't want that. Or t'as vu ça instead of tu as vu cela, or have you seen? So that's the register we use like when talking with family, friends, and generally anyone in our daily life. And the familiar register, which may include swear words and slang, tend to be more abrupt, sometimes rude, sometimes funny. It's concise and it's very interesting and it's more difficult to learn because it's developing and evolving much quicker because it is really a mix of local, territorial, cultural heritage with new and sometimes international influences. And so obviously people don't express themselves 100% in familiar or slang. They use colloquial and then they resort to familiar, including slang or swear words in varied proportion. Yeah, so being able to identify language registers and mirror them is really crucial when you're learning a language, and that's really one of my end goals when I'm teaching French. And it's really, as you said, what conveys your intention, because ultimately, I believe that each one of us, we have a core language register that we use in our daily life, but we do have the ability to borrow temporarily from the formal or the slang just to convey something special and cross that line that I mentioned about. And that's how, much more than double entendre and not saying and being indirect, that's how we would convey more sense beyond the words. It's by borrowing from different registers.
Yeah, and that's a really essential piece of this puzzle, I think, because obviously when you are a foreign language learner learning French, you might deviate from your register accidentally. You might accidentally use tu with someone with whom you should have used vous. You might have I have countless examples, but, a couple of favorites of, I had friends who had been learning French in a classroom context and who would meet a new friend and call them monsieur or vouvoie them, when everybody in the room is 20 years old and you're at a party. And that makes French people it makes French people laugh. Or there was a story of a girl who was in the French as a foreign language course that I was in, and she was being harassed on the metro. And she said to the man, arrêtez de m'importuner, which is this very highfalutin way of saying, buzz off. She should have used a different register. And that's surprising. But those are mistakes. And there are times at which people will mindfully deviate from the register, and that deviation from register adds meaning to that choice that they've made. And that's something that I think does require a certain deftness with the language to understand, because if you don't know that they've deviated from the register, then you're going to miss the meaning that they're trying to convey by that purposeful deviation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So when you're saying that, I'm thinking about two examples in two very different fields. So when President Macron said last year he wanted to emmerder les non-vaccinés, so the word was really out of place for a president. But I remember it made many international journalists really scratch their head in the search for the right words in their working language. So to be honest, I don't think it was that rude. I'm by no means a political commentator, but as a French person, I felt that his intention was just probably to get into the arena with the people in France who were a bit annoyed by anti-vax movement at that time and just use the same register to be along their side. And that was when he crossed the line, because he wanted to convey this proximity. We do have other examples in our political history of that borrowing from slang or from swear words that do work that way. And I have another example. I don't know if you're familiar or our audience is familiar with the series Camelot.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
A French program that has been very successful. This is about the history of King Arthur. and the quest for the Holy Grail, but done in French and very, very nicely written. and the writing is so dense, and it's so funny. And the whole comical aspect of this series lies in the fact that the King Arthur speaks in a register of the 20th century. He has a mind. He has a modern, very modern mind and way of expressing themselves, and it's just a contrast with the era that he's living in, and the speech, the tone of speech, and the register that he adopts. That makes for the whole comical aspect of the series. And there's a lot to say about this series in terms of how dense and difficult it is to translate. But this for me is really a good example of how not only the words, but like confronting registers and crossing lines do carry much more sense.
Yes, absolutely. When I first came to France, I was 14 years old, which makes you a very weird witness to culture, because you're still kind of a child, but you're also witnessing a lot. And so I feel like I was absorbing a lot when I was 14. And one of the things that I noticed was that I felt as though curse words and slang words and vulgarity was kind of scattered everywhere in people's daily conversation. It didn't seem as shocking to say things like bordel, which is a French word for bordello, and people use it, like damn or shit. Like they use it as a, and I wouldn't have to, I've said that just now and I'm like, oh, great. Now my producer is going to have to make this episode explicit, because I feel like as an American, we're very careful with how we use slang and vulgarity. And so, this concept that you were talking about with Macron, I do kind of wonder, like, is using a curse word less offensive to the French than it might be to the Americans or to the English in your experience?
It's your example of bordel is excellent, because to me, it's not, it's not that rude.
Right.
So we have much ruder words, but it is definitely a bit slang and certainly not in the formal register. So we don't, as I said, we don't have the same culture of political correctness throughout,
right,
compared to the United States. But that does not mean I don't think it means we are more vulgar or more accepting of vulgarity, because vulgarity is vulgarity. Okay, it's vulgarity in a context. So French has its own registers of vulgarity, because like in any language, vulgarity has its level of intensity and in different registers. Some of them are acceptable in daily life. Some of them can be truly offensive. So like bordel or even merde, I'm sorry, hope you won't have to edit this. It's vulgar, but not offensive.
Okay.
We do have more offensive words. Yeah, and it's difficult. It's like when things get lost in translation, really, because for the really cultural reasons you mentioned, and I think it's fair to say that swearing, for instance, is a lexicon where cultural insights and knowledge is really crucial to understanding, and it's like puns or jokes. It's really where context is, or history is everything, right? So if you look at translating, for instance, French swearing into another language, or just understanding it, the difficulty is that you have a wide variety of elements that you need to be knowledgeable about to get this intensity, and whether it is really offensive or just acceptable. So you have to know about the intensity of the swearing. You have to have a sort of generation knowledge, like who is talking, what are their age, are they, is it an old school word, or is it a neologism or hype words that they're more likely to use? And that's something that you need to reflect if you're translating into another language. And another point is, social, geographical clues or socio-economic clues, because the language we use reflect where we live and where we come from, etc. So when you translate or want to understand, you need to have a very large cultural knowledge in both the source and the target language to be able to convey all these dimensions.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes it's almost easier to see how that works based on other people's mistakes. And so, for example, I know that a lot of French people of my generation, so I'm, a millennial, I'm in my 30s, and a lot of French people of my generation who speak English, but not perfectly, will use a lot of English swear words as a replacement for the swear words that they're familiar with in French. And I think that the point that you made is really interesting in that it's not offensive. So they're using slang, they're using English swear words so frequently that it's jarring to a native speaker of English, but in French it wouldn't have been jarring because it's not offensive.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Absolutely.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, the Terroir Podcast, co-hosted by me, Emily, and Caroline Connor of Wine Dine Caroline. Each week, we take a deep dive into the food, wine, and more of a different region in France. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. You touched on something else that I think is really interesting in that we obviously talked a bit about how the French aren't necessarily trying to get you to intuit more than what they say, but the French do. And again, I'm overgeneralizing, but that's part of, talking about culture, as we have to generalize a little bit. I do get the sense that the French they do often speak on double levels. Like I hear in French people saying things like, take it on the first degree or the second degree, the deuxième degré, that they'll say something and it means something very clear, but there might also be a hidden pun or some wordplay, a jeu de mots that's kind of baked into the expression. Why do you think the French are so good at that? And can you really construe it as something similar to like a pun in English, for example, or is it different?
So it's very interesting. France has a very deep and long-standing literary culture and cultural culture. And we also have a deep and long-standing joute oratoire, like debating culture. So this was based, always on strict rules on how to write, like poetry or play. And those rules, centuries after centuries, have been like reinvented, reinterpreted, played with, rejected obviously. So wordplay, jeu de mots, is prevalent in this heritage. And in our modern life, I think it has translated into a very solid stand-up comedy scene, for instance, or a very buoyant French music industry, where beautiful texts are written every day, which are really like delving into the richness of our language and how you can play with it and how you can play with its rules and their double meanings and so on. So to me, this is where you will find the most wordplay. I mean, I don't think I see as many puns and wordplay in French communications and interactions that I see in England, for instance, where, puns and wordplay are in any advertising and TV shows. And I don't see it that prevalent in the French culture because I don't think it is wordplay is the go-to solution for French people when they want to be subversive or like convey a double meaning. As you said, we are generalizing. It doesn't mean that it does not exist. Like obviously, like comedians and songwriters resort to it a lot, or even in the context of the presidential and legislative elections. One can remember that the former leader of the far-right party, Jean-Marie Le Pen, is very famous for making very horrible, very offensive play on words, okay? So the language allows that and our culture allows to understand and to be an audience for that. But I'm sorry if I'm sort of debunking a myth here, but the French culture is not that subversive or risque, but we can be that, but we wouldn't use the double entendre or the wordplay. We would, again, I think, more resort to various language registers and borrow from the formal or from slang that does not belong to us to convey in a certain context something specific.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're debunking myths because I think that's what we're here for. And I mean, longtime listeners of the podcast will remember our episode on débat, remembering that, and even compliqué, the fact that the French don't necessarily shy away from being argumentative or from, entering into a conversation that doesn't have a clear answer, which I think makes maybe Anglo-Americans a little more uncomfortable. So the French aren't as afraid maybe of being uncomfortable, and that's maybe another piece of this puzzle as well.
Oh, yes, totally. I mean, it's, again, we talked about a scale, and French culture really sits, like, I think, in the middle between and totally indirect or totally direct. But I think, again, like a cultural trait establishing what is acceptable or not in interpersonal communication, so not as a personality trait for all the French people, I think we are fairly direct, and we do appreciate to know on which grounds we walk on when having a communication, a conversation with someone else. And I mean, it's probably so a mix of so much heritage and culture and history, but if you look at the French as a people, we are familiar with confrontation and voicing our opinion because historically, you can root this in the French Revolution, which is the absolute founding event of our modern culture. And, the subsequent mastering of the art of striking and demonstrating. So if we are able to do that, it means we are not shy just to express our disagreement or even our slight disagreement. We have words to express the slight disagreement. So when we have the mouais, the mouais is yes but no, but even like when I feel in English, if you have a slight disagreement, you would articulate a sound. We have a word for that. We have the mouais or we have the bof.
Mm-hmm.
So we are comfortable with expressing ourselves to express light or extreme disagreement. I think we are, yes.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Amazing.
And we don't mean it in a rude way. I think we just want to, again, we just want to give a ground to walk on and to build on a conversation. And it's maybe our Cartesian culture or, also the way we learn how to do a dissertation at school, which is super, super ruled and structured, the introduction, développement, conclusion. And to me, it makes sense, like the essays in English languages give more place for free flow train of thoughts, whereas French, we are very much structure. And so this also can be linked to our capacity or taste for being a bit more direct and explicit when we communicate with one another.
Well, Heloïse, thank you so very much for joining me on the podcast today. I only have one last question for you before I let you go, and that is, what is your favorite word in French?
Thank you for having me. Well, difficult for a French person also who works in the language, career to just pick one word. But there is an expression that has always made me laugh from the moment I discovered it, which is capillotracté. I don't know if you've heard it. So, you have this expression in French called tiré par les cheveux, which means pulled by the hair, which means far-fetched. And I don't remember where, but I heard like someone make from this tiré par les cheveux a more scientific sounding participe passé, which is capillotracté. So,
oh my God, I love that.
And I just love it. It's just again a play on language registers, because tiré par les cheveux would be like very colloquial or tending to the really informal, whereas capillotracté is the very formal and scientific sounding version of it. And so I think that's something that I like in our language again, and that we can play with the registers, and that's the challenge for people who are learning French, and you are helping them a lot with your podcast, I have to say.
Well, thank you so much, and I do think it's fun that the more you delve into a language, the more you get to have a little bit more fun with it, and that is a very fun play on words indeed. This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.